Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our webinar today, Understanding the Financial Data Transparency Act. My name is Ben Trippo. I'm the Legislative Representative for Revenue and Taxation at CalCities. I will be the moderator throughout today's presentation. For those of you who don't know me, I've been with CalCities now for about 5 months. Prior to joining CalCities, I was a legislative advocate for State Controller Betty Yee for 4 years. And before that, I was legislative manager at CalRecycle. I'd like to quickly note that it's been a great experience over these last few months getting to know CalCity members and learning about all the work that you're doing in your cities. If I have not had the opportunity to connect with you yet, I look forward to doing so in the near future. If you ever need to reach me, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. Now, a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. In case you miss any information, this webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be sent out after the webinar. Additionally, all attendees are muted, but you can write your questions in the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We will hold questions until the end. A couple of upcoming events I'd like to flag for the group. We encourage you all to register for the annual conference and expo from September 20th through 22nd in Sacramento. Registration is open now. The annual conference serves as a crucial platform to come together, exchange ideas, learn and acknowledge the collective achievements of our members. It promises to be a memorable event filled with engaging speaking sessions, networking opportunities, and innovative insights. So please visit the CalCities website for more information. We also want to remind you to save the dates December 14th through 15th for the Municipal Finance Institute in San Diego. More information and registration will be coming soon. Next, I want to take a couple of moments just to briefly mention how you can get involved with the CalCities Fiscal Officers Department, specifically the wide range of useful resources on the CalCities website. One of the ways you can become involved with CalCities and their members is the Fiscal Officers Listserv. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, it is a two-way communication tool for you to connect with others in the department. To access this listserv, you'll want to go to the CalCities homepage and find the Fiscal Officers webpage under Get Involved. Once you've reached the Fiscal Officers page, please select the highlighted Fiscal Officers Listserv link to be directed to the subscription page. From there, you can enter your name, email, city, and an optional password in the spaces provided. This page may also be used to view past archives or edit and remove your subscription. Once you are subscribed, you can simply send your post as an email to the address on screen or reply to others and their questions. Along with the listserv, CalCities provides monthly fiscal officer meetings that take place on the first Monday of each month at 3 p.m. via Zoom call. These meetings are another great way to get involved with the department, receive updates, and ask questions to peers. Please take note of the schedule and reach out to CalCities Department and Member Services Manager Megan McKelvey or Admin Associate Isaac Black if you're interested in joining these monthly meetings or have questions about the department's listserv. All right, so again, I want to thank you all for attending our webinar today. A little bit of background information for you. The federal government passed new financial data standards in 2022, known as the Financial Data Transparency Act. The legislation will require local governments to come into compliance with new financial reporting standards by 2027. The legislation mandates that governments put their financial information in a machine-readable format. This is going to change how many cities report financial information in the future. The goal here today is to learn about this new law, the ins and outs of machine-readable data, best practices, timelines, potential impacts to your city, and answer your questions. Today, we'll be hearing from Emily Swenson-Brock, Director at the Federal Liaison Center at the Government Finance Officers Association. As Director of GFOA's Federal Liaison Center, Emily leads coalition advocacy efforts of the Public Finance Network in Washington, D.C. Her advocacy includes anticipating and responding to federal legislation and regulatory activities that impact the finance functions of state and local governments and public sector entities, including tax reform, municipal security disclosure, and public pension and benefit issues. Emily also serves as staff on GFOA's Debt Committee, working with committee members to develop best practices that promote sound financial practices for local, state, and provincial governments. Prior to joining GFOA, Emily was a commercial bank relationship manager at a large national bank, serving as the sole bank liaison for government and university clients. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily to begin the presentation.
Ben, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Hi, California Cities. So nice to talk with you all. I look forward to fielding your questions. Please don't hesitate to drop them in the Q&A, Ben, and I will be hoping to answer most of those questions at the end. But I can tell you, I am really excited to talk with you guys today about something that is emerging, something that is taking up a lot of my sleepless nights, and something that I think is very important for California cities to become educated on. So thanks for being here. Thanks for listening for a bit. And I'd love to walk through that Financial Data Transparency Act that Ben mentioned. Now, one thing I think that is important about before we get started, we are all what you call issuers here. We are governments, but we are issuers of municipal securities. So it is a little bit one note. I mean, unless there are municipal advisors or bond counsel on this call, we are representing one side of the issue. There are a lot of market interests in the Financial Data Transparency Act, not only including issuers and those people who both have a fiduciary responsibility to represent issuers, that is municipal advisors, or bond counsel in representing our disclosures, but also investors are very interested in this. Investors are very interested in understanding how the digitization of financial data may or may not improve the information flow from issuers to investors. And so there are a lot of people at the table. I also didn't mention there are technology firms that are at the table, technology firms taking a large interest in being a part of this conversation and ultimately hoping to provide a solution for implementation for cities across the country. So with that, let me go ahead and get started in the presentation. Now I'm just making sure I have control of the slides. I do. So this isn't the first time the federal government has dipped a toe in trying to figure out how they may be able to digitize data. Now, unfortunately, we most often hope that it's the federal government digitizing data for us so that we can find information more readily. But often it's the federal government imposing requirements on local governments. Surprise, surprise. So one thing I just talking about 2022 and the fact that FDTA passed, I think it's important to note that there's a couple of other comprehensive federal approaches to creating, to revolutionarily creating data that's searchable, machine readable, and ultimately sort of simpler from a searchable perspective. So first, if we start back in 2006, in the before times, FFATA, that's the way you say that acronym, FFATA, the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, actually created a single searchable website for any stakeholders who are interested in understanding how federal financial assistance and expenditures from the federal government were being awarded. And so in 2006, that ultimately created the usaspending.gov website, which allows for us to search how the federal government is spending. Then that evolved into what was called the Data Act. So because not only do we have usaspending.gov, Data Act went a little bit further in 2014 to say, it not only do you have to present those federal financial assistance and expenditures, but also mandatory structured data standards for the federal government and participating governments receiving federal financial assistance. Now, I want to highlight the one at the very bottom, the GREAT Act. The GREAT Act actually passed in 2019, at the end of 2019. And this is the one that's most similar to the Financial Data Transparency Act. But one thing I think is very important to note, the GREAT Act has not been fully implemented yet. So while this act passed in 2019 and had a mandatory implementation date of December of 2022, it hasn't been implemented. So what the GREAT Act requires is for those cities out there who participate in single audits, that is, you receive over $750,000 in federal grants, you have to produce a single audit. Well, what the federal government decided was that all entities creating a single audit and submitting a single audit into OMB has to submit that information by a single data standard, and that single data standard that was selected was XBRL, which we will talk about in just a minute. Now, the GREAT Act, as I mentioned, while it passed in 2019 and should be effective by December of 2022, you can kind of note there was a there was a world event that happened between 2019 and 2022 that's prevented effective implementation of the GREAT Act. And one could argue 2022 was a little ambitious in and of itself. Digitizing single audits would require substantial revolutionary change for single audit participants, but nevertheless, the GREAT Act, as I said, still hasn't been implemented. And so it is very similar to what we're going to be talking about today, which is XBRL. So on the next slide, I want to kind of demystify where it came from. It does seem or appear as if local governments and state governments, those who are subject to this act, were kind of caught flat-footed. Senate Bill 4295 was a bill that was created by Senator Crapo out of Idaho, Senator Warner out of Virginia. And the bill is a very long bill. It requires digitization of data for recipients of federal information submitting information into the federal government. So by that, I mean, if you are an education institution, or if you're a transit institution, there are parts of Senate 4295 that require digitization of the data of reporting and compliance requirements into those federal agencies. But one federal agency that fell into 4295 was actually the MSRB, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. And if you have debt that has been issued, you know that you have continuing disclosure agreements. Those continuing disclosure agreements, as outlined in 4295, are part of the information that is submitted to the federal government. So when we say that you have continuing disclosure requirements that have to be submitted into the MSRB, those disclosures fall underneath this act. And the MSRB has an information repository system called EMMA, the Electronic Municipal Marketplace Act. And EMMA aggregates all of the information, the financial data, the financial continuing disclosures that are required of issuers of municipal securities. So when I say on this slide, who is paying attention to state and local government reporting? Well, broadly speaking, there's a lot of stakeholders who are interested in our financial reporting, but in particular, a large interested party are the investors of our municipal securities. So because of that, we do have a lot of interest. We have a lot of interest from the members of Congress in particular, who are kind of looking at the corporate world, and they were looking at the municipal securities world, and they were saying, well, hey, you know, if Coca-Cola and Hewlett-Packard have to do 8Ks and 10Ks and 8Qs, right? They have standardized financial reports that they have to submit into the SEC. Why in the world don't municipal securities have to abide by those same standards? Why can't we just have municipal securities report in a machine readable, fully searchable data format? And so that's actually kind of how it passed. You've got bipartisan support. You have an opportunity, or you know, a kind of confused Congress saying, well, if the corporate sector does it this way, why doesn't the municipal securities market do it this way as well? And so because of that, there was pretty broad interest in kind of establishing it as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, the National Defense Authorization Act has nothing to do with digitization of financial data. It has everything to do with funding national security interests. But nevertheless, the National Defense Authorization Act is often looked at like a Christmas tree that it's a must-pass bill that often attracts a lot of amendments that satisfy a variety of interests from our federal legislators. And so that's how 4295 became law. It was attached to the National Defense Authorization in a very quick shift, a very quick maneuver. There was significant outreach, and I do have to pay credit where credit's due to many California cities who did significant outreach during the passage of this bill. But nevertheless, here we are, and we are working through the Financial Data Transparency Act as it's been written into law. So on the next slide, one of the most important things that I outlined just before I started, a lot of folks are saying, oh my gosh, Emily, is this the entire municipal market, right? And when we're talking about the municipal market, we're talking about more than just cities. All issuers of municipal securities number in about the 75,000 range, right? So it's not just hundreds, it's not just thousands, it's tens of thousands, almost 100,000 entities issue municipal securities. So cities, counties, towns, villages who have municipal securities that are issued, but also universities, airports, water systems, states, you kind of name it, and they are a part of our municipal securities. Now, again, because of the way that this federal legislation is written, the only way that the federal government can mandate a state or local government to create a specific way to disclose their financial securities is through the SEC, the mandatory federal financial reporting requirements issued through 15 C2 12. And if you do have continuing disclosures that are part of your agreements with your investors of your municipal securities, those are the municipal securities that will be affected. So when we talk about muni securities, how many of the 75,000 entities, public entities across the country issue municipal securities? We're talking about 40,000 issuers who report into Emma. So it is also, I do want to note, this is still an outstanding question. If you are a conduit, that is, if you borrow through a state entity, or you issue municipal securities through a larger municipal entity, as I know many do, in the state of California, they too might be subject to this act. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit more about the timing. So we know who it's going to affect. It's issuers of municipal securities. And then what's the timeline? So the way that this law is written is that there are two-year segments. Now, I want to say we are 8 months in to the first 2-year segment. So the countdown is ticking and we are not wasting time. us and our sister organization, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, we are all working to try to figure out how to have our input best heard throughout the course of the 4 years. Now, Ben mentioned, a simple read of the legislation does say that it does require implementation by 2027. However, let's talk about the steps that it's going to take to get there. Now, in the first 2 years, what we need to make sure that we understand, we kind of wrap our heads around it, this is what's called the joint rulemaking part. Now, the joint rulemaking part essentially says there has to be an affected entity and the appropriate agency that reconciles that information together, deciding two very important things. The first thing that's important for them to do during this period of time is to identify a technology. So they have to figure out, number one, what is the technology that has the capacity to fully implement the structure of this law. Okay, so they're going to pick a technology, and we'll be talking about what technology might be on the menu. But then second, and a really important part of this conversation, is they have to make a determination of how to categorically understand the data that's coming to them. So you might say, hey, Emily, I got ARPA money, so therefore I've got a UEI. That can be the unique entity identifier that becomes sort of my social security number for information that's coming into Emma. Well, that's not necessarily the unique entity identifier that's going to be utilized by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So what we have is the United States Treasury and the Securities and Exchange Commission trying to figure out, number one, what technology should be employed, and number two, how are we going to issue identification information to 38,000 different entities? Some have argued there are other structures in the market like legal entity identifiers where there's a parent and a child relationship, but those types of relationships are very tenuous in our market. So that first 2 years, that, by the way, the first 2 years that we're 8 months in, they're going to, the Treasury and the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to put out a notice and comment, and GFOA, and we hope a whole host of California cities will also be responding to let those two agencies, Treasury and the SEC, know, number one, the technology, and number two, how to categorically assign identification numbers to our market. Okay, so that's just the first 2 years. Let's go to the second 2 years. Second 2 years is where they will be establishing the data standards themselves. And this is where I think civil war is going to erupt in the municipal marketplace, because as I mentioned, the municipal marketplace not only contains cities, it contains counties, states, universities, airports, et cetera, mosquito abatement districts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of us together are going to have to come together on what is the definition of a revenue, what is the definition of a liability, what are these definitions, and what are the data standards that should be reported underneath each one of them. And so I anticipate in the second 2 years, there being a significant amount of discussion, notice, and comment, questions about what is the most significant, the most impactful data standards that would satisfy all of the various participants in our market, not just the issuers, but also the investors, as I mentioned, maybe even academic community, maybe even municipal advisor community. There's going to be a whole lot of interests coming to the table defining what those data standards are. All right, so on the next slide, I know you didn't want to spend your afternoon talking about reading law. So what I did for us finance-minded people is I highlighted the important words to focus on. On the next slide, we've got, on the next slide, there we are, are the first section, that is the data standards. So what we need to make sure that we understand, and I kind of went into this a lot, so we have to make sure those legal entity identifiers, that social security number, those numbers that they're going to be assigning to the issuers who have to digitize their financial statements, we have to make sure that they understand, wherever the legal entity identifiers come from, that they have to be cost-free and they have to be risk-free. Those are our two important criteria when we're talking about any assignment of any mandatory registration moving forward. So that legal entity identifier is going to be especially important. Now, GFOA, I think at the very end, we were able to get in a few key poignant terms in the law that need to be focused on as we're submitting more information over to the Treasury and the SEC. And that is, those data standards have to be practicable. So as you can see in subsection 1B, we say to the extent practicable. So the data standards that are picked out, the data technologies that are picked out, and the legal entity identifiers have to be practicable for cities, counties, towns, villages, everyone in between. Now, to the extent practicable, what they say is about this technology, it has to render the data fully searchable and machine readable. We'll talk about each one of those. It has to produce high quality data through schemas. You can kind of think about that in terms of what does tagged output look like? What does an income statement look like? What does a balance sheet look like? And then last but not least, the technology that's picked has to satisfy an underlying regulatory information collection requirement. So what that means is it has to satisfy your continuing disclosure agreements that you are making to your investors through EMMA. So those CDAs satisfy that B3 component. Now, on the next slide, we talk a little bit more about the specific section that is municipal securities. So this is section 203 of the law. First of all, we got a clause put in there in section 8B where it says we have to make sure that those data standards that are created, that is, what is a revenue, what is a liability, what are the definitions of the data standards that we're going to be compiling, it has to be feasible. that these taxonomies that are created has to be feasible to be compatible. So it has to be practicable and it has to be feasible. Now, commission we require, so that is the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC has to consult, must consult market participants. That's not a may, that is a shall. And that's a very important term in federal legislation. So there will be significant outreach to muni market participants. Now, what they say is you need to make sure that that 2-year time frame, that is the beginning of the development of the data standards. It doesn't say that it has to be implemented. Instead, it says at the end of those 2 years, you have to have started a solicitation of the market of what those data standards might be. So when we say 2027, when we look at the Municipal Security Section 203, 2027 is sort of the beginning of where we start a more foundational discussion of what those data standards might be. So that's an important component. Last but not least, I do want to note these were a couple of big wins that we got in before the deal passed. First of all, we got scaling in. So scaling means what we're requesting for the SEC to do is to draw a bright line. Draw a bright line in between the entities that have to do the reporting and those that it would be an unjustified burden. Those to whom it would be an unjustified burden. Now, is the city of Los Angeles underneath the scaling requirement? Probably not. Are there smaller entities where implementing a new technology in financial reporting metrics would be an unjustified burden on communication with your investors? We will start to make that argument. That is certainly a part of the second 2-year discussion about where that bright line ought to be drawn. And last but not least, we have requested that the SEC consider where there is minimization of disruptive changes to affected entities. Now, they do say regulated entities. Local governments are not regulated entities. Municipal advisors and broker-dealers are regulated entities. And so therefore, there's a little bit of a hiccup in the law. It's not a very well-defined area where we can minimize those disruptive changes, but we did get that clause in there. So we will be certainly following up with our Senate sponsors in order to ensure that they understand where there is market disruption, that is where there is any kind of reduction in issuance as a direct result of the implementation of FDTA, that's a market disruptor. And the SEC has to protect against that. So we're certainly going to be inserting that in our comments as we move forward. Now, on the next slide, I just want to really kind of dive into some of the vocabulary terms. Now, I'm kicking and screaming my way into the world of technology and data standards in accounting, but I'm trying my very best to learn, and I'm trying to make sure that GFOA membership also understands what are the words that are used in this law and what does that mean as a direct result to the potential things that consultants will be selling us. So we can make the best decisions. We can make the best decisions on technology, and we know where to go. So first of all, in the FDTA, they define data standard. They say data standard means a standard that specifies rules by which data is described and recorded. Now, think about that in terms of, again, like I mentioned, the word taxonomy. So a taxonomy outlines what specific data needs to be tagged on PDF documents, for example, that can then be extracted into a machine readable format. Now, there's also data standards that you might be able to digitize the full volume of your financial statements. And that full volume of your financial statements then becomes an output in a specified machine readable format. One of the things that we've been looking at is the technology AI, of course, artificial intelligence, extraction of information over into different machine readable formats like XML or like JSON. So that data standard specifies what is the extracted information that we're focusing on, and then what gets put into the output. So on the next slide, talk a little bit more, dive a little bit deeper into that open source requirement. So again, in this first 2 years, Treasury and the SEC is going to be figuring out a specific technology that we're going to be using. They use the term open source. Now, the term open source, simply what it means, sort of colloquially what it means is this is something that's open to the general world. It's open to the general public. It is open source necessarily means that this document can be added on at any point in time. It can be added on with more information. It can be augmented by the user. And in so doing, the user then augments it for anyone else who's using that software. Now, I want to pinpoint this as sort of a key challenge with this law. So open source also means when the SEC asks for Coca-Cola and Hewlett-Packard to put in their digitized information, their financial statements, they are using an output called XBRL. And XBRL is digitized information that is open source. XBRL through the SEC for corporations submitting information is starting to expand because there are something like 4,000 public entities or public corporations that submit their information in through the EDGAR system. So when they submit the information in through the EDGAR system, that open source format allows for them to add more inputs. And an open source format sometimes gets a little unruly. Sometimes it gets added on to the point where it doesn't serve the purpose anymore. And so EDGAR has revolutionized from XBRL to a new XBRL format. I think that there's a lot of learning that's happening from that at the SEC. And hopefully there's a way that they can avoid that, because if we think about it in terms of sheer numbers, if the corporate sector is 4,000 entities and the municipal market is 40,000 entities, so 4,000 versus 40,000, you can imagine what an open source, non-proprietary format will look like when you have something like 40,000 entities going in to address the digitization of that data. So on the next slide, so that's open source. On the next slide, we talk about what does it mean to be machine readable. And I'm about to switch from English into a machine real quick. Now, I already mentioned, so you could compile your financial statements. Right now, it's certainly probably looking like, you have a chart of accounts. Maybe you have an ERP system that reconciles those charts into an output that is a ACFR, and that ACFR is produced as a PDF document. People have asked me, Emily, I can fully search a PDF document. Therefore, is it machine readable? And the answer is no. That is English text, and therefore it is not machine readable. When we talk about machine readable, what we're talking about is, can you put the data into a singular cell? Now, this is causing a little bit of a stir in our community because obviously GAAP requires significant notes disclosures on for entities producing their financial statements through GASB. And that's helpful. I would say there are investors who are very interested in the notes disclosures because they provide useful information for investment decisions, and they provide useful information for all extractors, all stakeholders of financial data. However, that said, that is not machine readable. So what Treasury and the SEC are going to have to consider when they're picking out a technology, this is exactly where we are right now. Treasury and the SEC are going to have to consider, what are the formats that are best executed to accomplish the goals of Financial Data Transparency Act? Is it an XML format? Is it JSON? Is it XBRL? Is it something as simple as a save as a comma separated value, a CSV value? That could be something very simple, but again, making sure that that data that is extracted in a machine readable format then has to be sussed out to the data standards that are agreed to in the second 2 years, right? So you can extract all the information you want out of the PDF and it can be a huge XML file, but all of that data has to be minimized into the specified data standards that are created as a result of this act. It has to be, revenues have to be taken out, liabilities have to be taken out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the data standards that are the part of the second 2 years. So you cannot, this is kind of a hard thing for Treasury SEC to think about. All right, we got to commit to like one type of machine readable open source format. And oh, by the way, that machine readable open source data format has to then be able to extract and report those data standards. So this is a tough operation. And I'm sure you can imagine and now envision why the GREAT Act hasn't necessarily fully been implemented just yet, because it is tough. So on the next slide, what I'd like to do is I'd like to articulate for you as a preparer of financial reports, or maybe you have a team that prepares your financial reports, of what the output, if we look 10 years down the road and we see this is fully implemented, maybe 15 years down the road, this is fully implemented, and this is something that that worked out versus didn't work out. So this is what it might look like. On the next slide, this is kind of a best case scenario. And I articulated this a couple minutes ago. So, you know, you probably have a number of operations or accounts that are churning financial information as we speak. So maybe you've got a pension fund, maybe you have an operating fund, maybe you have a capital fund, maybe you have an airport fund, maybe you have other funds that are inside of your basic structure of your charts of accounts. And that, like I said, those charts of accounts are churning information all the time. And you may or may not have an ERP system that at any point in time at the end of your fiscal year, you reconcile the information to your ACFR in that conversion. Now that conversion, whether it is through an ERP system or whether you do it manually, that conversion then becomes your ACFR, which you then submit, of course, through your audit. Now, the ACFR historically has been a PDF, especially when it comes to submitting that information through EMMA. What might happen is that is still the same process. You're not going to have to, well, again, I can't predict 15 years in the future, 10 years in the future, but you may still have to participate in the audit process. That is, GAAP is still a thing. So you will still have to report data in accordance with the GASB standards. And because of that, you'll have this PDF that will have a tremendous amount of information and will be useful for a variety of stakeholders, probably still the same stakeholders that are interested in ACFRs right now. However, what the FDTA is suggesting is that you take that PDF and maybe utilize a technology such as artificial intelligence to extract the data standards, to extract those specified data standards that have been identified through the second 2 years of implementation of FDTA. And then artificial intelligence then puts out those data standards in the form of machine readable open source data format, such as XML. Now, when I say XML, that is a sort of a broad umbrella for machine readable open source data format. So it could be put out in some form of XML. So that's the best case scenario. Let's talk about the worst case scenario on the next slide. This is essentially what GFOA is going to be fighting to avoid. We have a significant amount of variety in our market. In fact, if you look at Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, Kroll, you are looking at credit criteria that differs between different sectors in our market. In fact, as Standard & Poor's has identified at least 12 different sectors in our market. How in the world are we supposed to have identical data standards across airports, universities, counties, states, water systems, cities, that then create one single financial report? The reason that this is a worst case scenario is because there is going to be a lot of energy. There is going to be a lot of effort in learning. There is going to be, dare I say, ton of resources committed to trying to ensure implementation of the Financial Data Transparency Act. If at the end of the day, they create one single financial report that doesn't satisfy any stakeholders, that without question is a wasted effort, and worse, an unfunded mandate. So those are two things, of course, that we're focusing on with the National League of Cities, California League. We're trying to make sure that our federal partners understand that the last thing that we want to do is abide by an unfunded federal mandate that doesn't satisfy any of the information that's required from our stakeholders. So on the last slide, last slide. This has a little bit of movement in it. I want to go through each letter. So financial, F. If you click the mouse once, there you go, F. So we call it the Financial Data Transparency Act, financial. You presume that they mean financial information. And while a lot of us have gone to the ACFR and kind of presuming that, well, I guess this means that it must be the ACFR, that must be, that's what they're talking about. When in fact, there are a lot of disclosures that cities make to our investors. Let's say there was a social movement that occurred in your community. That social movement has everything to do with the narrative of the social movement. And, oh, by the way, there is a significant nexus to credit. Well, if all that you're asking for is financial information, you're going to be missing out on a lot of other voluntary disclosures that may be more useful to our investors. So that word financial is certainly a stress point, and it will be a stress point in all of the communications that we have with the Treasury and the SEC. So the next letter, D, data. Data essentially means that the data that will be produced by us, which is already produced by us, then will be easy to extract. There will be no new disclosures required. And oh, by the way, we've been promised by the Senate that it won't cost us a dime. We're going to be recording that. We're going to be asking, does it indeed not cost us a dime? And if it does cost us a dime, we are surely going to be responding to the Securities and Exchange Commission with how much it will cost in implementation. The next letter, T, transparency, probably the most frustrating red herring in this whole act. The reason I say that is because transparency is what we do. We were transparent before it was cool. And really what you're doing is you're adding on another layer of cost, of risk in the name of transparency. And so we're a little bit concerned that that red herring thrown in there, that word transparency, then made it almost impossible for us to talk reason to when it was passing. So it's important for us to highlight how transparent we already are and how transparent the communication process of our financial information to stakeholders already is. And then the last letter, ACT. All that means is that it's law. There's no reversing. There's no reversing the law as implemented. However, what I would say is the act itself can certainly be contested through active participation in the rulemaking process. So at the end of these first 2 years, when they ask about the technology and they ask about the legal entity identifiers, let's give them our opinion. In the second 2 years, when they're developing those data standards, let's give them our opinion. Because in reality, that notice and comment is our only tool at this point to sort of shift the progress, to take a minute to make sure that time is not the enemy of the good, and that we can create a process, the market can create a process that the market wants. And so that's the last slide, folks. That's all I've got for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Emily, so much for your presentation. Great information there. I'd like to encourage everyone now, if you want, we have a few minutes left for some Q&A. So if you want to start entering some questions into the chat. Looks like we already have a couple that have come through. First one would be, what is GASB's role in developing these new reporting standards?
Yeah, one would think that GASB would be the one that was, that is the parameters by which reporting happens. Because I mean, GASB goes through, we all know they go through significant, monumental standard creation processes. They do a lot of solicitation of the market and stakeholder input. They think about things thoughtfully. They have a ton of stakeholders at the table through the Gas Act. And so GASB seems to me to be probably one of the original probably one of the ones that should have been originally consulted. But I can tell you that when we did our stakeholder meetings on the Hill, we were talking with the Senate offices, they did not know who GASB was. So this is the level of information that we're talking about right now. That said, the law as it is, the FDTA actually requires for solicitation of the general market, including data standards from accounting standard setting boards. They don't say GAAP and they don't say GASB. And the reason that they don't say GAAP is because there are many entities out there that don't report according to GAAP. They report according to whatever their state requires for them to report. And so therefore that would revolutionize all of the reporting entities within vast states that may be a little onerous. And I think that the drafters of this bill actually understood, while they didn't know who GASB was, they certainly knew that by printing a requirement of following GAAP on top of this was indeed an unfunded mandate for many entities across the country.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions have come into the chat. Would this apply to agencies that do not have debt issuance?
So you do have to have debt issuance. You do have to have those continuing disclosure agreements, those things that require you to input information into the EMMA system. Now, I do want to caution folks, though, you should be like, okay, I don't issue debt, therefore I am not subject to this act. I would say just look very carefully at your entity. If you have zero debt issued, that is certainly a profile of a lot of entities across the country. They do cash basis, they continue to do that, and that is something that's implemented well across the country. However, some entities say, well, you know, I don't really issue to the market, but I issue through a conduit. I issue through the Housing Finance Authority, or I issue through some kind of conduit that's in our state. And in so doing, you then become an issuer of municipal securities. So while it's probably not that that's probably a very easy question, I would say, make sure to check your books, make sure to understand the capital structure that you have in your organization and any obligations that you have out there, because you could be subject.
All right, another question that came in: to confirm, there is no action we need to take at this time, and this won't affect us for a few years.
Yes, yes. This will not affect you for a few years. I want to stress, and this is a terrific question, I want to stress, do not buy what they are selling. Because we don't know the data standards yet, and we don't know the technology yet. What I would suggest instead, so first of all, don't buy what they're selling. Second of all, instead of just kind of sitting back, I would suggest a little bit more of a proactive approach to better understand all of those letters I said on the machine readable slide. What is XML? What is XBRL? Turns out XML is like ice cream. XBRL is like butter pecan. It's like a flavor of XML. So there's a lot of different ways, and they're starting to make it a little bit more conversational, and to better understand it. What is JSON? What is AI? How is AI going to play a role in the audit community? You're probably already seeing that with your auditors coming in, trying to utilize technology in a way that allows for entities to or the audit community to relieve a lot of the pressures that they have sort of going on. So that is to say, if you don't have to do any, there is no immediate concerns, except for number one, don't buy what they're selling. Number two, get smart on technology.
Great. Another question that came in: if we only have successor agency bonds but no municipal debt, how does this apply to our situation?
Successor agency bonds. So successor agency bonds. I think I might have to get smart on successor agency bonds. These are, again, if you have continuing disclosure requirements on securities that are issued to the market, that is how you are directly related. If you have any kind of continuing disclosure requirements to investors, those are where this kind of comes in. If you have any responsibility for reporting information onto EMMA, whether it's you or the conduit you issue through, that also may impact how you, or at least the format in which you are reporting your continuing disclosures.
Great. And then last question we have in the chat here: how is this different from open data standards?
So I don't know that it's different than open data standards. So open source data format means, I think we went through this a little bit ago, the open source data format means that it is a data repository that can be added to on by anyone who visits that repository. So that's open source. And then the data formats then have to be type of, or an extension of data that reduces significant volumes of information into a single cell. And so the accommodation of a narrative plus simple financial information then becomes sort of the open source data structure, or the open source data format, and then the machine readability of the extraction of that data. So embracing those two terms pretty wholly. So the open source notion and the machine readability notion means that we're going to be looking at a particular file format, and we're going to be waiting to hear what Treasury and SEC are going to ask us. I mean, what I anticipate the Treasury and the SEC to come back with on their first notice and comment period is probably like, hey, cities, there's all these different types of file formats. Which one do you like the best? And I'm sure we can say no to all of them. I don't know that that will be very effective, but I think that we need to come together, and part of that helps if you guys who are compiling the financial reports are smart on it, and you can say, hey, Emily, hey, Ben, this data format doesn't work. This data format doesn't work. This format might work. And here's how I could see it working. And then we have the capacity together to influence that data, that type of machine readable open source data format that Treasury then selects to create the data standards.
Fantastic. And then just a couple questions I had to round it out before we're out of time. Is there a place that cities can go to take a look at, like, to stay up to date on announcements from the SEC and the rulemaking? And is there a more formal process for them to provide feedback?
Yes. So what we will see is, through the process of the joint rulemaking, we will see the Securities and Exchange Commission come out with financial data transparency, Federal Data Transparency Act notice and comment. And the best place to stay up on that is the Office of Municipal Security. So OMS at the SEC. is the guardians, the protectors of issuers and investors in our market. And so whatever information that they have, whatever information that we need, they will be putting it out to us. The Office of Municipal Securities just finished a municipal securities conference last month. I would suggest that folks go over, and Ben, I can supply you with this with the link, but there is a pretty lengthy discussion from commissioners of the SEC, practitioners, and other folks talking about what does the implementation of FDTA look like? What is the SEC looking at in terms of data? And what is the SEC looking at in terms of timing? It's a pretty useful, even though it happened in May, I anticipate that we'll see that probably about every 6 months coming out of the SEC. And so we'll be fully prepared to comment back as soon as that notice and comment period begins, which will probably begin around August of next year.
Great. And it looks like we did have one more question or comment come through saying many softwares already have machine readable formats for their open budget data they provide on their websites. I guess maybe something I would add to that. I'm assuming that would all be subject to change kind of based off of the rules that the SEC comes out with.
Exactly. So if you have an ERP system or some kind of budget reconciliation software, and they've committed to a singular technology, they'll have to change it. And I don't know if that's going to be an upcharge to you as a client, or if it will be complimentary. But I certainly think that I don't think we are spring chickens here on this call. There is a lot of money to be earned off of this. And we need to be especially careful of monitoring what is a legitimate expense versus an expense that will have to change over time. Do not commit to purchasing or procuring anything at this point, again, because there has been no technology picked and there have been no data standards picked. So if there is a firm that's kind of saying we can comply with FDTA, unless they are Nostradamus, they aren't.
Well, I think on that, that's a great place to wrap up. I want to thank you all for taking the time to participate on the webinar today. Thank you to Emily for presenting this timely information. And if you have any questions, please contact Cal City staff. Information's on the screen. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.